The empath sits with the shadow as one might sit with a difficult guest one has finally agreed to receive. The reception had been long postponed, the guest had been at the door for years, and the empath had been telling herself, throughout those years, that the guest was the danger, that opening the door would mean letting in what she had spent her life avoiding. The literature had taught her this, the self-help architecture of her 30s had taught her this, the therapists, some of them, had taught her this, the shadow had been figured in all this teaching as the threat that lived inside her, the dark counterpart she would one day have to face, the buried aggression and selfishness and rage that had been waiting to corrupt her if she let down her vigilance. She let down her vigilance. Eventually, she opened the door, the guest came in, the guest sat down, the guest was not en inspection, what she had been told to expect. The guest was not the danger. The guest was, in fact, somewhat ordinary, somewhat tired, somewhat relieved to have been let in. The guest had been carrying, all those years at the door, something heavier than she had imagined. The guest set down what it had been carrying. What it set down was not aggression. What it set down was not rage. What it set down was her own power, which had been held outside the house for so long that she had forgotten she had ever possessed it. This is what Jung was pointing to. In a passage in his work on the shadow that is rarely emphasized because it complicates the simpler reading, when he wrote that the shadow contains not only the disowned darkness but also the disowned light, not only the suppressed aggression but also the suppressed authority, not only the buried rage but also the buried capacity for clean, sovereign movement through the world. The shadow is whatever has been excluded from the conscious personality, regardless of moral valence. For some people, the shadow is in fact composed of dark material that the conscious personality has refused to integrate. For other people, particularly for those who have been organized from childhood around relational accommodation, the shadow is composed of light material that the conscious personality has refused to integrate. The light material is just as exiled as the dark would have been, and the exile is just as costly. The empath, shaped by participation mystique, by the relational permeability that was selected for in her early environment, has spent her adult life believing that her shadow was her hidden cruelty, her hidden selfishness, her hidden capacity to wound others. She has worked, often diligently, to prevent these qualities from emerging. The prevention has been so successful that she has lived for decades as a person whose effects on others have been overwhelmingly soft. She has caused, by her own reckoning, relatively little harm. She has also, by a reckoning she has not yet performed, caused relatively little of anything else. The softness has been the medium of her existence. The softness has been what the world has been able to accept from her. The softness has also been what has been concealing what she actually is. What she actually is, when she finally allows the guest in, is not soft. The softness was the persona. The softness was the surface arrangement that allowed her to remain receivable in environments that would not have received her actual structure. Her actual structure, when it begins to emerge in the late phases of the work, has weight. The weight is what she had been hiding. The weight is what the shadow had been holding for her. All those years, at the door, the weight is her power, and the title of the lecture is naming with unusual directness what the conventional shadow literature has been failing to name about her particular case. Her shadow was never the danger to the world. Her power was, and her power is, and the world has been organizing itself since her childhood to prevent her power from coming online. This requires careful articulation because the language of power is, in the popular psychology she has consumed, almost entirely contaminated. Power has been associated with domination. Power has been associated with a kind of cold, calculating self-interest that the carrier of her shadow had been told to fear above all else. Power has been associated with the perpetrators of the harms she has spent her life absorbing. Within that semantic field, the suggestion that she might be powerful, that her power might be the actual content of her shadow, sounds like an accusation. It sounds like she is being told she has been secretly aggressive all along, that she is no different from the people who harmed her, that her gentleness was a disguise for a darker truth. This is not what Jung was pointing to. The power he was naming in the context of the shadow of the over-accommodated is not the power of domination. The power he was naming is the power of structural sovereignty, the power of being a center of gravity rather than a participant in someone else's gravitational field, the power of moving through the world according to one's own organizing principle rather than according to the organizing principle of whoever is currently demanding accommodation. The power is not aimed at anyone. The power is not hostile to anyone. The power is simply the condition of being a self that exerts its own field. And the empath has been refusing this condition for as long as she can remember, because the condition was, in her early environment, dangerous to enact. The danger was real. The empath was not paranoid in her childhood. She was correctly perceiving that her early environment did not tolerate the emergence of her power. The environment had been organized around the power of others, and the others had required her permeability in order to maintain their own arrangement. Had she emerged as a center of gravity in that environment, the arrangement would have destabilized. The destabilization would have produced consequences she could not have survived as a child. She therefore did the developmentally appropriate thing. She suppressed the emergence. She allocated her power to the shadow, where it could be kept safe from the environment by being kept out of consciousness. The allocation was a survival strategy. The strategy was successful. She survived. The cost of the strategy is what she is now examining in the late phase of her work. The cost is that she reached adulthood, and then midlife, and then late midlife, without ever having allowed her power to come online. The power has been in the shadow for 50 years, or 60, or whatever the actual count is. The power has been intact. The shadow does not damage what it holds. The shadow holds it in stasis. The power has been waiting in its undeveloped form for the conditions under which it can finally be admitted into the conscious personality. The conditions were not available in childhood. The conditions were not available in early adulthood, when she was still organizing her life around the relational economies that had been established in childhood. The conditions are available now in the late phase because the relational economies have collapsed, the carrier has been dismantled, and the structural space for her power to emerge has finally opened. The opening is not comfortable. This is the work of the first phase of this particular lecture, and it is more delicate than the work of the previous lectures in this series. The previous lectures concerned the dismantling of arrangements that had been costing her something. The cost had been visible, the exhaustion, the sleeplessness, the chronic apology, the projection onto a partner. The dismantling had been, for all its difficulty, a process of subtraction. She had been removing what had been weighing her down. The current work is different. The current work is a process of admission. She is not removing anything. She is admitting something that has been waiting to enter. The thing that wants to enter is her own power, and her unconscious does not, despite all the work she has done, entirely believe that the entry is safe. The unconscious is operating on outdated information. The unconscious learned in childhood that the entry of her power would be punished. The unconscious has not, in any operational sense, been updated since the conscious personality has been updated. The conscious personality knows that the original punishers are no longer present, that the environment has changed, that her power could now emerge without immediate catastrophe. The unconscious does not know this. The unconscious continues in the background to operate as if the original conditions were still in force. This is why the entry of the power feels from inside like a transgression. The conscious mind cannot identify what is being transgressed. The body, however, registers the transgression. The body tightens, the breath shortens, the familiar small dread arrives just behind the sternum. When she attempts to act from her actual weight rather than from the trained softness, the first weeks of admitting the guest are characterized by this dread. The dread is not psychological in the sense of being produced by current thoughts. The dread is somatic, the residue of the original training, surfacing now that the training is being contradicted. She will have a conversation in which she states a position without softening it. The position will land in the room. The room will, in most cases, accept it. The other people will respond to the position rather than to the softness. And in the moments following the conversation, in her body, the dread will arrive. The dread will say, in the only language it has, that something dangerous has just happened. The dread will be wrong. Nothing dangerous has happened. The dread is reporting from a time that no longer exists. She will have to learn over the following months to receive the dread as historical information rather than as a current warning. The receiving is the work Jung described in a passage in his late work on the integration of unlived contents that the most difficult phase of integration was not the encountering of the disowned material, but the somatic tolerance of its emergence. The somatic tolerance has to be built slowly by repeated experiences of acting from the previously disowned position and surviving the consequences. The consequences in adulthood are almost never what the body has been bracing for. The body has been bracing for annihilation. The actual consequence is, in most cases, that the conversation ends and life continues. The continuation is the information the body needs. The body needs the information repeatedly. The body does not believe the continuation the first time. The body does not believe it the third time. By the 12th or 15th time, the body begins to believe. The belief takes the form of a slight reduction in the dread that arrives after the act. The reduction is the structural change. The change is what allows the power to come further online. The other people in her life, by this phase, have already adjusted to many things. They have adjusted to the cessation of her apologies. They have adjusted to the closure of her availability. They have adjusted to the withdrawal of the carrier function. They have not yet adjusted to her power. The power, when it begins to emerge, is the thing they have least prepared for. The other adjustments had concerned what she had stopped doing. The power concerns what she is beginning to do. The doing is new. The doing is not yet smooth. The doing will, in many cases, be received by the others as a kind of out-of-character behavior, qu'en aberration, a phase she is going through. Some of them will wait with what they believe is patience for the phase to pass. They are operating on the assumption that the carrier was her real self, and that this new emergence is the deviation. The assumption is incorrect, but they cannot know it is incorrect, because they have known her, in many cases, only as the carrier. The carrier was, for them, the original. The power that is now emerging is, in their perception, the strange new development. They do not understand that the carrier was the strange development, the construction, disowned suppression of the original. They do not understand that the original is what is now finally being allowed to come forward. 50 years late, into a life that has only a portion of itself remaining, she does not, in this phase, undertake to explain this to them. The explanation would itself be a regression to the carrier function. The carrier had explained, had translated, had made her own movements legible to the people around her, so they could continue to perceive her as the same. The translating is not part of the current work. The current work is to allow the emergence without translating it. The emergence does not need to be understood by anyone other than her. The understanding by others is a separate question, which she may or may not undertake to address in some future phase with the people who remain in her field. For now, she lets the emergence emerge. The others perceive it as they perceive it. The perception is theirs to manage. She is no longer managing the perceptions of others. The managing was the carrier's job, and the carrier is no longer employed. The power, in its first emergences, does not look like the power she had imagined power to look like. It does not look like the power she had observed in the people who had harmed her. That power had been loud, dominating, organized around the suppression of others. Her power is quiet, organized around the occupation of her own space, indifferent to the suppression or non-suppression of others, because suppression is not its function. Her power is structural. Her power is the simple fact of her now being a center of gravity in the rooms she enters, rather than a participant in the gravity of others. The structural fact is registered by other people without their being able to name it. They feel, in her presence, something they did not feel before. They cannot identify what they will say in various forms, that she has become more grounded, that she has acquired a kind of presence, that something has shifted in how she carries herself. The descriptions are accurate but imprecise. What has shifted is that her power has, after a lifetime of exile, finally come home. The homecoming is the work of the second phase of this lecture, which examines what the power, once home, does. The doing is not what the popular literature predicts. The popular literature predicts that integrated power produces achievement, visibility, a more impressive life. The integrated power, in her case, produces something subtler and more durable. It produces, first, the cessation of a particular kind of disappearing she had been performing for decades. The disappearing had been so habitual, she had not known it was happening. The cessation is felt by others before it is named by her. By the time she names it, the disappearing has already ended, and what remains in its place is the steady, weighted presence of a person who has finally been admitted into her own life. The admission is what the work has produced. The admission is what the next phase will allow her to inhabit. The power, once admitted into the conscious personality, begins to behave in ways the empath had not anticipated. She had expected, on the basis of what she had read and observed, that her power would announce itself. She had expected to feel different in a noticeable way, to walk into rooms with a sense of expanded capacity, to experience the integration as a kind of internal dawn. The expectation had been formed by literature that was not written about her particular case. The literature had been written, in most cases, by people whose shadow had contained different material, and whose integration had therefore produced different phenomenology. The empath's integration is quieter. The empath's integration does not produce dawn. The empath's integration produces, in its first weeks of operation, a strange and almost embarrassing sensation of weight. The weight is the most accurate word for what she now carries inside her body that she had not carried before. The weight is not heaviness in the depressive sense. The weight is gravitational. It is the simple physical fact of her presence in space having more density than it previously had. She does not, at first, know how to account for this. She had been for 50 years. A particular kind of light. The lightness had been the absence of the power. The lightness had allowed her to be moved by whatever was happening in the room. She had thought the lightness was sensitivity. She had thought the lightness was a form of attunement. The lightness was, in significant part, the structural condition of being without her own weight. The current weight is what attunement actually requires. Because attunement to others without one's own weight is not attunement. It is being blown around by their wind. She begins to notice that her body, in conversation, no longer moves in the small involuntary ways it used to move. She used to lean forward when others lean forward, lean back when they lean back, mirror their gestures, match their breath. The mirroring had been so continuous that she had not known she was doing it. She had thought she was simply present. The mirroring is no longer happening, or it is happening only when she chooses to enact it. The choosing is new. Her body has acquired the structural property of staying where it is, regardless of what other bodies in the room are doing. The staying is not deliberate. The staying is the somatic expression of the weight. This is what Jung meant in a passage in his work on the integration of the unlived self, when he wrote that the integrated person is recognized first by the body of the people around them. The recognition is unconscious. The other people, encountering the newly integrated person, register the change at a level that precedes language. Their own bodies adjust. They begin to relate to her differently before they have any conscious account of why. Some of them find the new register more comfortable. Others find it harder to bear. The variation depends on what they had been using her permeability for. Those who had been using the permeability to feel held by her now find that the holding has stopped, and they will need to find a different way to feel held. Some of them will manage this, others will not. The internal mechanism by which the weight begins to organize her behavior is worth examining slowly, because the popular literature does not describe it accurately. The popular literature suggests that integrated power produces clearer decisions, more decisive action, a stronger sense of direction. This is partially true, but it misses what comes first. What comes first is not clearer decision. What comes first is a substantial reduction in the number of decisions she feels obligated to make. The carrier had been making, in any given day, hundreds of small decisions on behalf of others. The decisions had concerned how to respond, how to soften, how to translate, how to adjust her own behavior to manage the affect in the room. Each of these decisions had been so quick that she had not registered them as decisions. They had been the texture of her cognitive life. The weight removes the texture. The weight does not require that she manage the affect in the room. The affect in the room is the room's affect. The weight allows her to remain inside her own affect, regardless of what is happening in the affect of others. She finds that her cognitive load over the course of a day has dropped substantially. She has bandwidth she did not previously have. The bandwidth was being consumed by the constant management. The management has stopped. The bandwidth is available. She does not, in the first weeks, know what to do with the bandwidth. She has not had it before. She finds herself in idle moments, simply present in a way that the carrier was never present. She is in the room without scanning it. She is at the table without monitoring the others. She is in the body without continuously calibrating it. This is the structural inversion the title was pointing toward. The empath's shadow had been figured in her own self-understanding as the danger she would have to manage. The shadow turned out to contain her power. Her power, when admitted, did not become a new management problem. Her power dissolved the management problem. The management had been the function of the carrier. The carrier had been managing in order to compensate for the absence of the power. With the power present, no compensation is required. The management can end. The ending of the management is what produces the experience she had not been able to imagine in advance, which is the experience of being, for the first time in her adult life, simply available to her own perception without the perception being immediately routed into relational labor. The perception itself, in this phase, undergoes a subtle and important alteration. The carrier had perceived others as relational variables to be tracked, to be managed, to be soothed. The integrated person perceives others as people distinct from her, with their own weights, their own movements, their own dynamics that do not require her continuous intervention. The shift is structural. The shift is also somewhat lonely. In a way that requires careful naming, the loneliness is not the loneliness of isolation. She has not become isolated. She is still in proximity to the same number of people as before. The loneliness is the loneliness of having stopped merging. She had been, all those years, partially fused with the people around her. The fusion had felt from inside, like deep connection. The fusion had been, in structural terms, the absence of the boundary that distinguishes one consciousness from another. With her power admitted, the boundary has been restored. The boundary is not hostile. The boundary is simply structural. She is now perceiving from inside her own outline, rather than from the diffuse field she used to occupy. The perceiving from inside the outline is what most people experience as the ordinary condition of being a person. She has not, until recently, experienced this. The experience is, for her, both new and strange. A dream came to her in the third week of this phase. She was in a house she did not recognize. The house had many rooms. In each room there was a person she knew, doing something. In one room her brother was reading. In another room her sister was on the phone. In another room a friend was looking out the window. She walked through the rooms. She greeted each person briefly. None of them required anything of her. She came to a room that was empty. The room had a chair in it. She sat in the chair. From the chair, she could hear the small sounds of the other people in the other rooms. She did not get up to attend to any of them. She sat in the chair, and the sounds continued, and the house continued to be a house, and she was inside it without being responsible for it. She woke from the dream with a feeling she could not. At first, Name, the feeling was not happiness. The feeling was not relief. The feeling was something closer to the sensation of having taken up residence. She had moved into the house. She had not previously been resident in the house. She had been, in some hard-to-describe way, the housekeeper of a house she did not own. The dream is naming what the integration of power structurally accomplishes. It is the recovery of ownership of one's own interior. The interior had been, for the carrier, a kind of common area. Others had been able to enter at will. Others had been able to leave their affect in the rooms. Others had been able to expect that she would tidy after them. The integration of power converts the common area into a residence. The residence has a resident. The resident is her. The residence is no longer common. The others may visit en invitation, but they cannot enter at will, and they cannot leave their affect for her to tidy. The conversion is not announced. The conversion is structural, and the others register it slowly by encountering the locked doors where there used to be open passages. The second dimension of the internal mechanism, less obvious than the weight, is the alteration of her relationship to time. The carrier had lived in continuous anticipation. The anticipation had been of the next demand, the next phone call, the next interaction that would require management. Her sense of the future had been calibrated by what others might want from her. Her sense of the present had been organized around preparing for what would shortly be asked. The integrated person does not anticipate in this way. The integrated person inhabits the present without continuously rehearsing the immediate future. The rehearsal had been the carrier's primary cognitive activity. The rehearsal has, with the integration, largely ceased. The cessation of the rehearsal produces an experience she had not anticipated, which is the experience of time slowing down. The time has not actually slowed. The clock is running at the same speed. Her experience of the clock has changed because she is no longer running ahead of it. She had been, for decades, mentally arriving at events before they occurred. She had been at the dinner before the dinner. She had been at the conversation before the conversation. She had been at the family gathering for weeks in advance, in her mind, preparing the configurations of self that would be required. With the carrier's apparatus disabled, she now arrives at events when they occur. The arrival in the present produces, by contrast with the previous arrival in the anticipated future, a sensation of expansion. Each moment, no longer crowded by the imagined moments ahead of it, has more room in it than it used to have. This is what Jung described in a phrase from one of his late seminars as the recovery of psychological time. The phrase has been quoted in various contexts, often loosely. The precise meaning concerned the difference between living in the chronological time that the carrier inhabits, in which time is continuously being borrowed from the future to service the demands of the present, and living in the psychological time of the integrated person, in which time is available for direct experience rather than for advanced management. The empath in this phase is moving from chronological time into psychological time. The movement is not metaphysical. The movement is structural. It is the result of having stopped using cognitive resources to manage what has not yet occurred. The integrated power also alters her speech. She did not anticipate this either. The carrier had spoken in a particular register that was calibrated to the listener. Her sentences had been shaped in real time to land softly, to leave space for the listener's response, to avoid the small assertions that might require the listener to disagree. The integrated person speaks differently. The sentences acquire what can only be described as their own shape. They are not shaped by anticipation of the listener. They are shaped by what she means. The meaning is now allowed to determine the form of the speech, rather than the form of the speech being determined by the projected receptivity of the listener. This produces, in the early weeks, a number of small social events. She makes statements that the listener does not know how to respond to. Because the statements have not been pre-shaped for easy response, she articulates positions with a directness that the listener experiences as unfamiliar. Even when the position itself is mild, she declines invitations with a brevity that the listener finds disorienting. Because the carrier had always declined invitations with elaborate justification, the disorientation is not hostile. The disorientation is simply the response of people who had been calibrated to the carrier's speech, encountering speech that has been recalibrated to her own meaning. Some of these people adjust to the new speech within a few weeks. Others continue, for some months, to operate as if the carrier's speech were still available, and they keep waiting for it to return. It does not return. They eventually adjust, or they reduce their contact with her, or they continue in a kind of low-grade confusion that is no longer her responsibility to resolve. The new speech is not a project she is performing. The new speech is the somatic consequence of the integration. It would require active effort now to return to the carrier's speech. The effort is not available. The apparatus has been retired. She notices in this phase that she has begun to listen differently as well. The carrier had listened in a particular way that was structurally a form of preparation. She had been listening for what was being asked, for what would be required, for the effect she would need to mirror or absorb. The integrated person listens more simply. She listens to what is being said. The listening is, in its first weeks, almost embarrassingly basic. She had not, she realizes, been listening like this for most of her adult life. She had been listening through the carrier's apparatus, which had filtered the speech of others through the question of what she would need to do about it. The filter has been removed. The speech of others without the filter is just speech. Some of it is interesting, some of it is not, some of it concerns matters relevant to her, some of it does not. The discrimination is now available to her in real time. Previously, the discrimination had been blocked by the carriers. A priori assumption that all speech of others was, in some way, addressed to her capacity to respond. The result of the altered listening is that her conversations become both shorter and richer. They are shorter because she is no longer engaged in the elaborate verbal performance that the carrier had been performing. They are richer because the speech that does occur is now addressed to actual content rather than to the management of affect. The people who remain in her field, after the adjustments of the previous phases, are largely people who can also speak in this register. The conversations they now have with her have a different character than any conversations she had previously been part of. The conversations have weight. In the same sense, her body now has weight. The conversations are not heavy. The conversations are substantive. The substance is what was missing in the previous conversations, although she had not been able to identify what was missing while it was missing. The empath, by the end of the second phase of this work, is no longer recognizable in any meaningful structural sense as the person she had been. The recognizability of the carrier had been her primary social asset. The recognizability is gone. She is now a different person, occupying the same body with the same name in approximately the same locations. The difference is not visible from the outside in any single feature. The difference is everywhere. The difference is the weight. The weight is the power. The power has come home, and the home it has come to is her. And the her she now is not what anyone, including her, had been prepared for. The next phase will concern the cost of this transformation, which is the cost the popular literature most reliably refuses to name. The cost is that the integration of power, while structurally healing, is also structurally isolating, and the isolation is not temporary. And the isolation is the price of having become someone whose presence in the world is now organized by her own gravity rather than by the gravity of the relational field. This cost is what the third phase will examine. The isolation arrives slowly and does not announce itself as isolation. The empath, in the third phase of this work, does not wake one morning and find herself alone. The structure of her external life looks, from the outside, much as it did before. She still has the people who survived the earlier adjustments. She still has her short list. She still has the work, the apartment, the routines of an ordinary life. The isolation is not located in the absence of people. The isolation is located in the structural fact that almost no one in her immediate environment is operating from their own integrated power. And the operating from one's own integrated power is, by its nature, a condition that requires similar conditions in others to be fully met. This is the cost the popular literature most reliably refuses to name. The literature wants to suggest that the integration produces, as its natural consequence, the arrival of one's people. The literature suggests that once the carrier has been dismantled, the right relationships will appear, calibrated to the new structure, capable of meeting her in the register she has come to inhabit. The suggestion is not entirely false. Some such relationships will appear. They will appear in numbers far smaller than the literature implies. They will appear at intervals far longer than the literature implies. The waiting between appearances will be substantial. The waiting is what the literature does not describe. Because the description would not sell, she begins to register in the third phase that the rooms she enters contain almost exclusively people who are still inside the participation mystique she has now exited. This is not a moral observation. The people are not at fault. They are simply where they are. Most adults remain throughout their lives inside participation mystique to some degree, because the exit from it is structurally difficult, costly, and not socially encouraged. The empath has, by sustained internal labor, performed the exit. The exit has placed her in a structural location that very few of the people around her occupy. The location is not superior. The location is simply rarer. The rarity has consequences for what is possible in her ordinary social field. What she notices increasingly is that conversations she previously found nourishing have become slightly thin. She does not say this to anyone. The thinness is not the fault of the conversations. The conversations are operating at a register the carrier would have found fully satisfying. The integrated self does not. The integrated self is registering at a level that precedes language, that the conversation is occurring between her, who is present from her own weight, and an interlocutor who is partially present, with most of their attention engaged in the management of relational signals that have, for her, ceased to be operative. She can still participate, she can still respond. The participation is no longer the meeting she had previously experienced it as. The meeting is, in most encounters, asymmetric. She is meeting them fully. They are meeting her at the register they meet everyone in dashed, which is the register of relational management. Jung wrote about this asymmetry in a letter to a former patient in the early 1950s. In a passage that did not become widely known because it was uncomfortable to quote in the contexts in which his work was being popularized, he wrote that the individuation process, when actually completed, in the sense he meant, produced a person who would, for the remainder of their life, to be slightly out of phase with the social field around them, and that this out of phase condition was permanent, and that the popular reassurances about finding one's tribe were largely sentimental projections from people who had not actually completed the work and were therefore still expecting integration to be socially rewarded. He noted, with characteristic restraint, that integration tended in fact to be socially mildly punished in the form of the slow disappearance of certain kinds of relationship that had previously been available, and that the integrated person had to come to terms with this without bitterness, which required a discipline that few of his correspondents possessed. The empath, in this third phase, is being asked to develop this discipline. The discipline is not a technique. The discipline is the structural willingness to remain integrated in the absence of social reward for the integration. The reward had been promised implicitly by the literature she had consumed. The reward had been, do the work and you will be met. The work has been done. The meeting has been, at best, partial. The partial meeting is not failure. The partial meeting is the actual structural condition of integrated adults in social environments that are not constituted to recognize them. The recognition that the meeting is partial and that it will likely remain partial is itself part of the integration. The integration would not be complete if it included the unconscious expectation that the world would now align itself to her new weight. The world is not going to align. The world will continue to operate as it has been operating. The integrated empath is one center of gravity in a field that contains many other centers, most of which are operating on the older model in which gravity is borrowed and redistributed through relational permeability. Her gravity, by being internally generated and structurally stable, will, in many encounters, be experienced by the other as a slight withdrawal from the relational economy. The other will register this without naming it. They will feel that she is, in some hard to articulate way, less available than she used to be. They will be correct. She is less available because availability in the old sense required the permeability that her power has now sealed. She develops, in this phase, a kind of social tact she had not previously possessed, and the tact is itself a product of the integrated power rather than a performance of softness. The carrier had been tactful by withholding her own positions in order to leave room for the other. The integrated self is tactful by understanding with some precision what the other can actually receive and offering what is receivable while keeping the rest. The rest does not need to be hidden, but it does not need to be deployed. The integrated self has learned that the entire content of her current interior cannot be transmitted to most of the people she encounters, not because they are unworthy, but because the transmission would not arrive at its destination. The receiving apparatus is calibrated to a different register. Speaking into the wrong register is a failure of communication, regardless of the speaker's intentions. The tact consists in recognizing the calibration of the listener and meeting it accurately, while reserving the rest for the small number of relationships in which the calibration is closer to her own. This is what Jung meant in his work on relational maturity. By the phrase he used to describe the integrated person's social functioning, he called it differentiated communication, by which he did not mean elaborate code switching or strategic withholding. He meant the structural recognition that different relationships could bear different weights, and that the integrated person had stopped pretending otherwise. The pretending had been the carrier's function. The carrier had pretended with everyone that all available weight was being offered. The pretending had been a courtesy that distorted the carrier's actual movements through the world. The integrated self no longer pretends. She offers to each relationship the weight that the relationship can hold. The offering is precise. The precision is itself a form of respect, because it does not ask the other to bear what they cannot. The grief of this phase is the slow recognition that her precise offering will, for most of her remaining relationships, be a small offering. The relationships that can hold her actual weight are few. The relationships that cannot are many. The many relationships are not, by virtue of their limited capacity, valueless. They have their own integrity. They serve their own functions. She can be in them, can enjoy them in their proper register, can extend to them the warmth that fits their carrying capacity. She cannot have, in most of them, the meeting she now sometimes craves. The craving is the residue of the integration. Integrated power produces, as a structural side effect, the appetite for being met by other integrated power. The appetite cannot be satisfied by relational fields that do not contain it. She has to learn to carry the appetite without resentment and without the assumption that the appetite is going to be satisfied at any predictable schedule. A second dream came to her late in this phase, and the dream was older in character than the previous dreams. She was standing at the edge of a lake. The lake was wide and still. She could see, on the far shore, a small fire burning. She understood, in the dream, that the fire was tended by people who were doing the same work she had been doing, and that the people had reached the same condition, and that the lake separated her from them. She also understood, with the strange certainty of dreams, that the lake could not be crossed by ordinary means. There were no boats, there was no bridge. The lake was simply self. She stood at the edge for some time. She did not feel despair. She felt, instead, a kind of quiet acknowledgement. The fire existed. The fire was tended. The lake was real. The condition was structural. She woke without distress, but she carried the dream with her for several days. The dream had named eine Image. The structural condition the third phase was making explicit. The fire of integrated company existed. The empath was not the only person in this condition. She was, however, separated from most of the others by structural distances that ordinary social movement did not bridge. The bridging, when it occurs, is not engineered. The bridging happens when it happens, through the slow operation of what Jung called, in his last years, the field of like resonance. The phrase referred to the way integrated psyches, over time, tend to encounter each other through processes that are not consciously directed by either party. The encounters do not happen on demand. The encounters happen at intervals, often years apart, and the encounters are recognized when they occur by the unmistakable somatic signature of being met in full weight. The meetings, when they happen, are why the work was done. The meetings are also rare. The rarity is structural. The empath has to live in the intervals between meetings on what the meetings have given her, supplemented by her own internal company, which is now, by virtue of the integration, finally adequate to the task. This is the structural achievement the third phase makes most visible. The integrated empath, for the first time in her life, can be alone without being lonely. The carrier had been lonely in every form of solitude, because the carrier's interior had been organized around external relational signals, and the absence of those signals had produced a void the carrier could not inhabit. The integrated self has an interior that is its own company. The interior contains weight, perception, the steady current of her own attention to her own life. Solitude in this configuration is not deprivation. Solitude is the condition under which the interior can be fully occupied without the partial dispersal that other people, in their non-integrated state, tend to produce. She can be in solitude for hours, for days, without the loneliness that the carrier would have produced within minutes. The new tolerance for solitude is not a virtue, it is a structural property of the integrated psyche. This produces a paradoxical condition that the literature, again, does not describe accurately. The integrated empath is, on the one hand, capable of solitude in a way she has never been before, and, on the other hand, retains an unsatisfied appetite for the rare encounters with other integrated centers of gravity. The two conditions are not in conflict, they coexist. She can spend most of her time alone, with her own weight, in deep and undisturbed company with herself, and also recognize, when she occasionally meets another person operating at the same register, that the meeting offers something her solitude does not. The meeting offers the experience of her weight being met by equal weight, of her perception being met by equal perception, of her presence being met by equal presence. The meeting does not displace her solitude. The meeting refreshes something in her that the solitude cannot, by itself, refresh. The cost of this configuration is that she has, in effect, narrowed the range of relational satisfactions available to her. The carrier had been able to find a kind of satisfaction in almost any relational encounter because the carrier's satisfaction had been generated by the act of accommodation itself. The integrated self has lost the satisfaction of accommodation. The integrated self can only be satisfied by the encounter with another integrated weight, which is structurally rare. The empath has, in this sense, become harder to please. The being harder to please is not snobbery. The being harder to please is the structural consequence of having grown a self that the carrier did not have. The self requires meeting on its own terms. The carrier could be satisfied with much less because the carrier was not, in the technical sense, fully present in any of those encounters. The empath in this phase has to make peace with being harder to please. The peace is not the assumption that her needs will eventually be met more frequently. The peace is the recognition that the structural condition is what it is, that her remaining years will contain a relatively small number of encounters that meet her fully, and that this is not a failure of her work, but the actual shape of integrated adulthood in a world that has not, on the whole, integrated. She does not become bitter about this. The bitterness would itself be a regression. The bitterness would be the carrier returning under a new costume, demanding that the world adjust to her, asserting that she has earned, by her work, a different result than she has in fact received. The work has not earned her a different result. The work has earned her the structural condition itself, which is its own reward, and which is also, for the rest of her life, the daily condition she must inhabit. She inhabits it. The inhabiting is not dramatic. She continues her work, sees her short list, has her conversations in the appropriate registers, walks through her city, and sleeps her recovered sleep. The structural condition is in the background of every day. The structural condition does not require her active attention. The structural condition simply is the way the weather is, neither to be celebrated nor lamented, but to be lived in. The living in is the new normal. The new normal is what the integration has produced. The integration has not produced a more impressive life. The integration has produced a life that is finally hers, and the cost of its being hers is that it is not, in any important sense, anyone else's, and most of the people she encounters cannot, however willing, fully share it. The next phase, the final phase of this work, concerns what she does with the rest of her time in this condition, and how the power she has integrated continues to operate, not as something she deploys, but as something that simply shapes the field she now moves through. The shaping is what the title was finally pointing toward when it named her power as what had always been the actual content of her shadow. The power is now in the world. The power is now her ordinary condition. What the world does with it is not, by this stage, her concern. The rest of her time, when she comes to consider what to do with it, presents itself differently than she had expected. The literature had taught her to expect that the integration would deliver, in its final phase, some sense of mission. She had been told, in various forms, that the integrated empath would discover what she was here to do, that her work in the world would crystallize, that the recovered power would seek its proper application and would, of its own movement, organize her remaining years around a vocation. The teaching had been delivered with such consistency that she had, without quite noticing, accepted it as the structural promise of the work. The promise is not what the work delivers. The work delivers something more modest and, on closer inspection, more durable. The work does not deliver a mission. The work delivers, instead, a condition in which the question of mission has lost its urgency. The urgency had been generated by the carrier who had needed to justify her existence through visible service to a relational field that required justification. The integrated self does not require justification. The integrated self is simply present, and the presence does not seek external validation through accomplishment. This does not mean she stops working, or stops acting, or stops engaging with the world. It means that the work, the action, the engagement no longer carry the structural weight of being what makes her existence permissible. This is the structural reorganization the final phase makes complete. The carrier's economy had been an economy of permission. Each day had been a renewal of the permission to occupy space granted in exchange for visible service. The integrated economy is not an economy of permission. The integrated economy is an economy of presence. The presence does not need to be earned. The presence is the basic condition. What she does within the presence is, for the first time in her life, a question of choice rather than a question of justification. The choice, when she begins to examine it, is not what she had imagined. She had imagined, in various forms over the years, that her integrated self would choose grand things. She had imagined writing a book. She had imagined founding something. She had imagined, in her more inflated moments, that the recovered power would express itself in a public form that would, in some way, mark her arrival. The imagining had itself been a residue of the carrier. The carrier had needed marking, because the carrier had needed external evidence that her existence had become legitimate. The integrated self does not need marking. The integrated self can choose, for the remaining years, things that are entirely unmarked, and the choosing is not a failure of ambition. The choosing is the structural expression of having stopped needing the ambition. What she actually chooses, when she allows herself to choose without the inflation, is small. She begins to spend more time in her own kitchen, cooking what she actually wants to eat, in quantities she actually wants. She begins to read books she has been meaning to read for years, and to abandon them when they do not interest her, without finishing them, without guilt about the abandonment. She begins to walk in her city in the late afternoons, on routes she has not previously taken, for the sake of the walking rather than for the sake of any destination. She begins to spend longer hours with her short list of people, in conversations that have shape because the participants have shape, and to spend less time, almost no time, with the larger field she had previously been managing. The smallness of these choices is what the final phase asks her to accept. The acceptance is not resignation. The acceptance is the recognition that the integrated life is composed, in its actual day-to-day texture, of small things attended to fully, rather than large things attended to partially. The carrier had attended to many large things partially, because the carrier had been spread across a relational field that required her to be everywhere at once. The integrated self attends to fewer things fully. The shift from quantity to depth is, structurally, the entire content of what the literature had been calling, with too much romance, the integrated life. Jung described this in his last decade, in a passage in one of the late essays that has been quoted less often than his more dramatic statements. He wrote that the individuated person in the late phase becomes recognizable not by what she does, but by the quality of attention she brings to what she does. He noted that the attention is the actual content of the individuation, more than any external achievement. The achievement, when it occurs, is the secondary product of the attention. The attention is the primary product. The attention is what the work has made available. Without it, no achievement is meaningful. With it, even the smallest activity has its own completeness. The empath, in the late phase, begins to live inside this completeness. She does not name it. She does not need to. The completeness operates in the background as the structural condition of her days She makes her coffee in the morning, and the coffee is the coffee, and the making is the making, and the morning is the morning, and none of these require her to be anywhere other than where she is, doing what she is doing. The previous condition, in which every small action was a way station to some imagined future, or a reparation for some imagined past, has ended. The current condition is that each action is itself. The being itself is the structural achievement. This produces a side effect she had not anticipated, which is that her presence in rooms begins to have a particular kind of effect on the people in the rooms. She does not engineer this effect. She is not performing it. The effect occurs because integrated presence is structurally somewhat unusual in the social environments she moves through, and the unusualness registers in the people who encounter her. Even when the encounters are brief, some people become slightly calmer in her presence. They cannot say why. Others become slightly more agitated, because their own permeable systems are registering the presence of a sealed system and are uncertain how to relate to it. The variation is not within her control. The variation is what happens when integrated presence enters fields that are not constituted to recognize it. She does not capitalize on this effect. The carrier would have noticed the effect and immediately begun to wonder how she might use it, how she might serve others through it, how she might convert the unexpected resource into another form of permission. The integrated self does not capitalize. The effect is simply an effect. It is not her project. It is not her responsibility. The people who become calmer in her presence are welcome to be calmer. The people who become more agitated are not, by their agitation, calling her to do anything. The presence is the presence. What it produces in others is the structural consequence of their encounter with it, and the consequence belongs to them. This is what Jung meant in one of his rare remarks about the social function of the individuated person, when he wrote that her function is not to do anything in particular for others, but to be what she has become, and to allow her being to operate as a kind of small structural pressure in the environments she moves through. The pressure is not aggressive. The pressure is not coercive. The pressure is simply the gravitational fact of her integrated weight, which other psyches, when they encounter it, must in some way relate to. Some of them will be drawn toward greater integration themselves, having registered, without knowing what they have registered, that such integration is possible. Others will move away, having registered the same thing and found it inconsistent with their current arrangements. The empath does not direct this. She simply continues to be what she now is. A final dream came to her in the early summer of her 61st year, and the dream was the briefest of the dreams that had come during the entire arc. She was standing in a field. The field was wide and flat. There was nothing in the field except her standing in it. The sky was overcast but not dark. She was not waiting for anything. She was simply standing. She woke from the dream with no urgency to interpret it. She lay in bed for a few minutes, the dream still present in her body, and she understood, in a way, that did not require words, that the dream had named the structural condition she had finally arrived at. The field was the field. She was the one standing in it. There was nothing to do in the field. In the sense of accomplishment, the standing was the activity. The standing was sufficient. The sufficiency is what the final phase delivers. The sufficiency is structural. The sufficiency does not depend on what she does next, on what she achieves, on what the remaining years contain in the way of events. The sufficiency is the condition of being adequate to her own life, of being the one who is having it, of being the resident in the residence the work has produced. The sufficiency had been the missing element in the carrier's life. The carrier had been chronically insufficient, no matter how much she did, because the doing had been a substitute for the being. The integrated self has the being. The doing, when it occurs from inside the being. The doing is no longer a compensation for what the being could not provide. The power that the title named, which had been the actual content of her shadow, has by this final phase fully entered her. It does not announce itself. It does not produce drama. It produces, instead, the steady, undramatic condition of being a person who is the center of her own gravity, who walks through her city without looking for permission to be in it, who speaks when she has something to say and is silent when she does not, who chooses her company carefully and does not apologize for the choosing, who eats her dinner without an audience, who sleeps her sleep without sentry duty, who occupies her body as her own residence, rather than as a vessel rented to a relational field. The relational field, by this phase, has largely concluded its business with her. The field has either adjusted to the new arrangement or moved on. The people who remain are the people who can be in relation to her on the terms her integration has established. The people who could not are no longer in active contact, and she does not, in most cases, miss them. The not missing is not coldness. The not missing is the structural fact that the relationships had been carried in significant part by her capacity to be other than what she was, and the capacity has been retired. The relationships could not survive the retirement. Their conclusion is, in retrospect, an accuracy correction rather than a loss. What she does with the years remaining to her by the close of this work is no longer a question that has a public form. The question has become entirely interior, and the interior is now her own. She may write something, she may not, she may begin a project, she may not, she may travel, she may not. The choices are open in a way they were never open before, because the chooser is finally present. The chooser is making decisions on her own behalf, with her own weight, in her own field. The decisions, whatever they turn out to be, will be hers in a way that almost no previous decision of her adult life was hers. This is what the title had been pointing toward from its first phrase. The danger had not been her shadow. The danger had not been the dark material she had spent her life fearing. The danger had been the structural fact that her power was being held outside her, in the shadow's keeping, and that her life was being lived by the carrier in the power's absence. The carrier had been gentle. The carrier had also been, in the deepest sense, vacant. The vacancy had been mistaken by herself and by others for kindness. The kindness had been real in its effects, but provisional in its source. The kindness had not come from her. The kindness had come from a part of her that was substituting for the unavailable whole. The whole has now become available. The whole includes the kindness which remains, but the kindness is now hers, generated from inside the integrated structure rather than performed from inside the carrier's vacancy. The kindness in this configuration is sturdier than it was. The kindness does not exhaust her. The kindness does not deplete the reserves. The kindness comes from a source that does not run out, because the source is her own weight, and her own weight, being structural rather than transactional, replenishes itself simply by her continuing to be the person she has become. She closes the door of her apartment in the late afternoon. She walks to the window. The city is doing what cities do. The light is the light of an ordinary day. She stands at the window for some time, holding nothing, requiring nothing, present in the body that is hers, in the residence that is hers, in the life that is hers. The standing is the achievement. The achievement is not an accomplishment. The achievement is the structural condition the work has produced, and the condition will hold for the remainder of her life, because the apparatus that maintained the previous condition has been retired and cannot be reassembled. The power has come home. The shadow has given back what it had been keeping safe. The empath stands in her own field, in her own weight, and the field is, finally, here to inhabit.
This has been Carl Jung Original, a space where the patterns most people live through can finally be named. Voice and imagery, AI-assisted interpretation and framing, original work. Until next lecture.